Journey into Europe made its way to Cambridge, UK, where it had the opportunity to visit Magdalen College at Cambridge University. It was here that Professor Akbar Ahmed had the opportunity to meet his friend, former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams.
Good evening, Rowan. It's the 13th of May 2016 and it's about 11:30. And obviously I'm making you my usual Friday evening video to reassure you that I won't be seducing any priests over the weekend, so you can relax. Anyway, I said I was going to talk about the London bombings this evening, which actually that was because I forgot what I was really going to talk about. But it is connected in a way, because I want to show this video, which I've shown a bit of already, of you interacting with this Muslim man who's a friend of yours. Well, he may be a friend of yours, but you're not a friend of his. And this isn't personal. It's not because he's a Muslim or because he's not a nice person or anything. It's because you're a psychopath and you're actually incapable of making friends with anybody in any real sense of the word. You're only observing people and finding out about them and finding out what their weak points are, what the things that are important to them are, so you can use and exploit these things. And this isn't a cynical view of mine. This is how psychopaths operate, and it's my opinion that you're a psychopath. And the reason I think this is because I've seen how you operate, and I've seen you interacting with other people. I know the way that you've behaved towards me, and in a way this is similar to the way that you behaved towards me, because I've read out a letter on the videos I've made for YouTube before that you wrote to my friend in November 1993, when you said that you were supporting me and you were criticising the people who weren't supporting me. This was to be a deacon in the church in Wales, and you actually said that there was something wrong with them, or there was something wrong with the committee that made this decision. So you were saying to my friend, and to my face you said, but I don't have that in writing, but I do have what you wrote to my friend in writing, on your headed notepaper with your signature at the end of it. I do have that in writing, that you said you were supporting me, and then behind my back you were causing all these catastrophes and trying to drive me to suicide or to come under your control, as I've demonstrated before. And what I'm saying about this really is this is a consistent pattern in your behaviour. This is something that you're trained to notice when you work in mental health, in terms of how better to support people and enable them to overcome any difficult feelings or coping strategies that are not very good that they might have. And you spot these patterns in their behaviour, and also to enable you to do risk assessments as well, to see if they're likely to harm themselves or anybody else. So this is the part of the training for working in mental health, and I'd had a lot of experience in that. I worked in mental health for 12 years, as I've said, and a large part of my last job particularly was assessing people and either taking them onto my caseload or referring them on to other agencies if they had different support needs to the ones that I was providing at that time. So this is what I'm saying. This is a pattern in your behaviour. This is what you did to me. You were effusive in your support of me to my face, and I've got it in writing that you said that to my friend, and critical of the people who weren't supporting me. Yet behind my back you were causing all these problems, and we see this in your interactions with Muslims as well, because you're the one who's causing Islamophobia by providing anti-Muslim propaganda about 9/11 and the London bombings and so on, and the bogus assassination of Osama bin Laden, who was working for the CIA, so was controlled by the same people that you're being controlled by as well. So you're doing all of this, yet to the face of Muslims you're supporting them against the irrational crazy public who are scapegoating them and misunderstanding them and believing they're all terrorists and this kind of thing, when in fact it's you putting it into the minds of people that they might be terrorists, as I've already demonstrated, particularly in relation to your propaganda around 9/11 and the London bombings, in which you clearly can't be telling the truth. And it's an amazing coincidence that you happen to be personally involved in both these events. I suppose it's the same kind of coincidence, like your clock's saying 9/11 and you're making Illuminati hand signs in videos where you're talking about things that undermine traditional Christian faith and bring in a subversive version of that that teaches environmentalism, which is the globalist goal for a one world religion. So this is another one of those coincidences, you turning up everywhere where Al-Qaeda turns up. And actually, you know, we're looking out of my window again this evening. Well, I've been living around here for quite a long time and I haven't seen any Al-Qaeda. It's quite boring, really. You'd think they'd show up now and again, wouldn't you? Anyway, but I thought, well, I'm obviously not very good at spotting Al-Qaeda because wherever I go, there is no Al-Qaeda. But wherever you go, they just show up, don't they, on the same day? So I thought if I did another film out of my window, you might be able to spot them, because I did film one before, didn't I? But that was in daylight, and I thought, well, Al-Qaeda, perhaps they only come out after dark. So here's a dark video, so you can look out of the window and see if you can spot Al-Qaeda going past out there. Since they always show up when you go somewhere. Anyway, I'm going to talk now about some of the things that you said in this short video to your friend. So you say, in a way, it's a rather sad reflection on how little in this country and some other countries we've tried to get alongside our Muslim neighbours and understand what makes them work. We have had substantial Muslim populations in the UK for a while, but only in the last 10 or 15 years have we really tried to listen to them and work with them. So when you're talking about the last 10 or 15 years, you're talking about 9/11, aren't you? Since 9/11. So this is part of the globalist goal, isn't it, to converge all the religions and then say, oh, you can't get on together, look, all these genocides keep spontaneously happening because, as you said, people just wake up one day and forget their neighbours are human, which I find quite bizarre, really, because quite aside from any moral consideration, I mean, who's really got the time to start a genocide? It would be an awful hassle, wouldn't it, for someone to just wake up one day and start a genocide. I mean, what happens? Is it because the football season's over, or it's unseasonally hot weather, or maybe all your friends have gone on holiday, or you've got a week off work and you're at a loose end? So you're sitting in your house thinking about what to do and you can't think of anything, so you think, I know, I'll start a genocide, because that seemed to be what you were promoting in your video about Rwanda, which wasn't a genocide, by the way. That was misrepresented in the press, and it was an invasion by a foreign army. So I might make another video about that. I might do that on Sunday. Anyway, moving on to what you've said here. It's only in the last 10 or 15 years that we've really tried to listen to them and work with them. This is Muslims that you're talking about. Well, if I refer back to that Christopher Hitchens article that I put a slideshow on my video about the Berlin Wall, Donald Trump. So, I mean, he said, you know, that he wanted to promote immigration into the UK when he was a revolutionary Marxist. And one of the things that he said was that revolutionary Marxists never came from working class backgrounds. They really only lived in Surrey and the leafier parts of London. So you're not from Surrey or the leafier parts of London, but you are from the leafier parts of Cardiff. You lived and went to a private school in Whitchurch in Cardiff, which is a leafy suburb. And then you lived in Oystermouth and went to a grammar school there in Swansea. So you won't have been studying or working alongside Muslims, will you? And you've operated in the upper echelons of English society for all of your adult life. You've worked in the Church of England and in Oxford and Cambridge universities, and so this is why you haven't had anything to do with Muslims, you see, because there are quite a lot of Muslims in West Yorkshire. And when I was growing up, I lived on a council estate. It was nearly entirely white working class people who lived on this council estate, and my primary school I went to was slightly off the estate, and around that area there were quite a lot of Muslims living. We didn't think about them as Muslims actually, we just thought about them as Pakistanis. Well, their parents were, at least, even if they'd been born here. They were very young, obviously, at primary school. So I've actually known Muslims from being 4 years old, and the fact that they were Muslims wasn't really relevant. It was more that they were Pakistanis and they dressed differently and they ate different food, and sometimes they didn't speak English very well. And Islam just wasn't an issue. It didn't. All it meant to us at primary school was that the girls wore trousers, which, I mean, I know white girls wear trousers as well, but the Muslim girls all wore a shalwar kameez, which is a kind of a dress in women and girls, and then trousers underneath. So this is what it meant, that girls kept their legs covered up. And that was all I knew about Islam, but I wasn't thinking that anybody was a terrorist, and nor was anybody else, because nobody was telling us that they were terrorists. I mean, even the most extreme people who would say to their face, "Oh, go back where you came from," or something like that, they wouldn't have even thought of calling them terrorists. If you'd even told these people, "Oh, they're going to blow up the London Underground in a few years' time," they'd have probably thought you were crazy. The only reason anybody thinks that Muslims are terrorists is because scumbags like you are telling them that. And so I've lived and gone to school with and worked with, had colleagues who were Muslims and lived in the area of Muslims all my life. So who are you talking about when you say we haven't really tried to get alongside them? You mean people who you think are important, like white middle class academics? Is that what you mean? Because the rest of us were kind of living there, you know, with the Muslims, so we didn't think they were terrorists. Even the people who hated them didn't think they were terrorists. So the reason that people think they're terrorists is because you're telling them that. And Islam just wasn't an issue. If there was an issue, it was the fact that they were a different race. It had nothing to do with their religion. It was because they were immigrants of a different race. If people didn't like them, it wasn't anything to do with their religion. It was totally irrelevant. We never thought about their religion. Nobody thought about it. And you say then, and I think the phenomenon of Islamophobia reflects some of that waking up thinking, well, I don't know what my neighbour's thinking, they could be planning anything, and a panic reaction. Right, so the people who are living alongside the Muslims, I suppose you're talking about, because you're not living alongside the Muslims, are you? So you're saying these people are thinking this. Well, I've just said, you know, the only reason anybody might be thinking that is because you're telling them to think that. And also, the majority of people aren't thinking that most of the time. I mean, we weren't thinking it about the Irish were we? We didn't panic if there was an Irish person living next door to us. It was just completely ridiculous. I mean, this is just ridiculous. I don't know what my neighbour's thinking. They could be planning anything and a panic reaction. Well, that would be a reasonable reaction from someone living next door to you, wouldn't it? Considering that you're thinking about bringing down Western civilization, killing off most of the world's population, enslaving all the rest of us, and making Britain like Yugoslavia in the 90s. So that would be quite a reasonable thought for someone living next door to you, wouldn't it? I don't know what my neighbour's thinking. They could be planning anything and a panic reaction. I think I'd be panicking if I lived next door to you. And then you say, when you realise you've not really got close to your neighbours, you can either panic or you can say, well, it's time I started, isn't it? Well, this is a false dichotomy. Those aren't the only two options. You don't have to have anything to do with your neighbours at all if you don't want. It doesn't matter whether they're Muslims or not Muslims or who they are. You don't have to get to know them not to be panicking about them. If they're just going about their business in their family or on their own, however they are, it's really got nothing to do with anybody. What the neighbours are doing, it's nothing to do with anybody. So there aren't only two options. I mean, the best thing to do is to stop listening to scumbags like you, and then people wouldn't be so worried about these things, would they? They'd be outing you as an Illuminati shill. So you say, so either you react with projecting all sorts of mysterious and terrible things onto them, or you sit with them and listen. What would be the point of that anyway? Just assuming your neighbour was a terrorist. So you go and sit with your neighbour and listen, and your neighbour's a terrorist. Are they going to tell you that they're planning to blow you up or something? This is just ridiculous. Anybody's free to listen to Muslims or to listen to any people they want, but if someone's a terrorist, they're not going to tell you what they're going to do. So this is completely irrelevant, really. I mean, it would help not being suspicious of most people who wouldn't be terrorists anyway, even if there were terrorists among these people. But you're a terrorist, as I've said before, and there's no point listening to you because you lie about absolutely everything. You know, there was in my school there were two boys who were really good friends, and we were at school all the time, in the same school, from when I was 4 to when I left school at 16. We were all, you know, these two boys I'm referring to were in the same school all that time, and they were really good friends, and one was Pakistani and the other was white. This white boy who was friends with the Pakistani was telling us one day, I can speak Urdu. Well, we were all laughing at him because we thought this was a joke. We thought he couldn't possibly speak Urdu. So we were saying to him, well, say something in Urdu then. So he said something, and there were some other Pakistani boys there, and they said, oh yeah, that's right, and they told us what he'd said. So we believed him after that. So, I mean, this, I'm talking about 1973 is when I started school. So that's 43 years ago. And why is it then that I was living alongside Muslims and you weren't? Oh yeah, it's because I was working class. And this is where the immigrants came. And by the way, you might be interested to hear that there's a lot of people in ethnic minority groups who are really against immigration, lots of immigration, because when the immigrants come, they don't go and live with people like you. They come and live in white working class communities and in places where other people from other ethnic groups are living, and sometimes, well, quite a lot of times, it's young men who come. They don't have their wife with them, or they don't have a wife yet, and they're much more likely to cause problems in the community than the people who are living there already. So it's not just white British people who are against massive immigration. The ethnic minority people, a lot of them who are living there already, don't want huge amounts of newcomers in their community, because it causes problems, social problems, which you don't have to deal with because you've never lived in these areas. So you're there pontificating, saying we have to get to know Muslims. But they've been, I mean, I've known them since 1973, Muslims, and besides which, one Muslim isn't the same as another Muslim. They're not the Borg. So anyway, I shall leave that there, and I'll comment on another thing in a minute.
There is a growing sense recently, I would say last couple of decades, of what is being called, for lack of a better word, Islamophobia.
Mm-hmm.
There's more and more misunderstanding. People jump to conclusions. Muslims will point out that any incident committed by any Muslim is immediately labeled as or attributed to Islam, versus what happens if a Christian or Jewish person or Hindu does something. How would you explain this phenomena? Because it seems to be growing, it seems to be widespread, and it seems to be creating friction.
In a way, it's a rather sad reflection on how little in this country and some other countries we've tried to get alongside our Muslim neighbours and understand what makes them work. We have had substantial Muslim populations in the United Kingdom for a while. Only in the last 10 or 15 years have we really begun to try to listen to them and work with them. And I think the phenomenon of Islamophobia reflects some of that waking up and thinking, well, I don't know what my neighbour's thinking. They could be thinking anything. They could be planning anything. And a panic reaction. When you realise you've not really got close to your neighbours, you can either panic, or you can say, well, it's time I started, isn't it? So either you react with projecting all sorts of mysterious and terrible things onto them, or you sit with them and listen.
So you go on to say, you still hear strange words like Islamist, and I'm a bit puzzled by a word like that. You still hear this curious distinction between moderate and radical Muslims, that is, nice and nasty Muslims. Well, firstly, the word Islamist has been invented as well since 9/11, because Muslims were protesting about being categorised as terrorists, and these supposed terrorists who supposedly did 9/11, they said they don't represent Islam, which indeed they don't, because they didn't do it and it wasn't Muslims that did it. So this is why the word Islamist was invented, and also Islamophobia was invented after 9/11, as I've said before. So you're the reason, Rowan, that these words even exist at all, a large part of the reason. People like you. And I'm a bit puzzled by a word like that. This is Islamist you're talking about. You still hear this curious distinction between moderate and radical Muslims, that is, nice and nasty Muslims. Well, if we accept the official narrative that some Muslims knock down the Twin Towers and blow up the London Underground, which is the idea that you're promoting, which I don't believe, but this is what you're saying, well, then there is a distinction between Muslims if we accept your version of events, because not all Muslims were going around doing these things, and as it turns out, none of them were, but it's you who's saying that some of them were, so obviously some of them are prone to terrorism if it was them that did it. And so there are nice Muslims and nasty Muslims, and even despite the fact that it wasn't Muslims who did these things, there are still nice Muslims and nasty Muslims, because people are individuals and they have moral agency. You want to be categorising everybody and talking about them in the collective like they're all the same, like all Muslims have the same interests and the same opinions and all this kind of thing, and it's just completely ridiculous. You only ever talk in collectives. These categories are meaningless. This is moderate and radical you're talking about, and nice and nasty. They don't correspond to what Muslims say about themselves, and you just have to be there and listen to how people do describe themselves. Well, I don't know whether Muslims say this about themselves. If their understanding is that Muslims did do these things, then they're wanting to say, if they're not terrorists, then these are not people like us, they're radical, or they're Islamist, or they're somehow different because they're doing these terrorist things and we're not. So this is what Muslims have been saying, who accepted the official version of events. So that is how Muslims have been describing themselves, but you're wanting to lump them all into the collective, and obviously you're the reason why people are categorising Western Muslims and Muslims acting in the West as terrorists. So you go on to talk about anti-Semitism now in response to a question from your friend, and you say that the church has to take a heavy responsibility for, I think it's European anti-Semitism that you're talking about. And then you say, if you look at the beginnings of Christianity, you can see there a rhetoric which comes from a sense that Christians are a minority and Jewish authorities are making their lives difficult. Well, if you're talking about the beginning of Christianity, the Jewish authorities were doing more than making their lives difficult. They were actually executing them, stoning them to death and so on. But this is right at the very beginning, because it wasn't long into the beginning of Christianity when the Jerusalem temple was destroyed in AD 70, and this led to a Jewish diaspora anyway. And also Christianity originally started off as a Jewish sect, and there were only Jews who were Christians, and then Gentiles very early on were admitted to the church. They could become Christians, and then Christianity spread out quickly around the Mediterranean region. So the beginning of Christianity, some Jews were actually stoning Christians to death. They were murdering them. Saul is one of them, who had a vision of Jesus saying, "Why are you persecuting me?" And then he became a Christian and went round evangelising. So Jewish authorities were doing more than making Christian lives difficult at the time. And also, you know, the high priests did condemn Jesus to death. And you previously have said, you know, that some of the things that Jesus said could be twisted around and used as anti-Semitism when he was criticising hypocritical religious leaders. And my response to that is that you don't care about anti-Semitism. You just don't want someone like me quoting the words of Jesus to condemn a hypocritical religious leader like you. And as I've said before, you've accused me of anti-Semitism before. You're not doing that in this video. You're just talking about it. I will come on to that a bit more later. But Jesus was a Jew, and you've even said that some of the things he said could be twisted round to anti-Semitism. Well, I suppose if you're going to twist them and say, oh, well, he was condemning Jews, you could do that. But he was actually condemning hypocritical religious leaders, and we needn't look no further than you. You find that in the New Testament and in the very earliest writings. Well, everybody who wrote the New Testament was Jewish, so it was Jews talking about other Jews if they criticised Jews, which they sometimes did. You know, they said they were hiding for fear of the Jews and this kind of thing. But the Jews had just handed Jesus over to the Roman authorities to have him executed, and they were quite frightened about that, as you would be. And then they, you know, stoned Stephen to death, the first Christian martyr. So they weren't just making their lives difficult. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing at all. You're talking about the criticism of Jews in the New Testament, which was written by Jews. So it was some Jews criticising other Jews. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing at all, but it's immeasurably worse when the power relations have changed, when it becomes powerful Christians and powerless Jewish communities, or less powerful Jewish communities. Well, I hope you're not talking about the situation today where you've previously called me a Nazi and anti-Semitic and said I had no historical sense and all this kind of thing because I was criticising the Rothschilds, who are the most powerful people on the entire earth and are controlling all the banks and controlling everything. But because I'm not a collectivist, as I've said before, I'm not tarring all the Jews with the same brush, and as I've also said before, the Rothschilds don't practice Judaism, they practice Luciferianism, the same as you, so you're all part of this Luciferian conspiracy. But to say, I mean, it's just ridiculous to present, if you're talking about now, to present Christians now as immensely powerful, all Christians I mean, and all Jews as being the underdog, when actually the Rothschilds are in charge of everything and have led to great persecution of the Jews and a bad situation for the Jews in many places, and led to Jews being ethnically cleansed from Europe. They were behind the Holocaust to frighten the Jews out of Europe, and then they went and frightened them out of other places where they were living perfectly happily. And really, Europeans have been scapegoated for something that they weren't in control of, although many people collaborated with it. And from at least the 4th Christian century onwards, that's the situation. You're talking about Christians being very powerful and Jews being not very powerful. So you're talking about everybody as if they're only part of a collective now. There are no like individually powerful Christians and individually powerless Christians. All Christians are powerful and all Jews are less powerful because you think in collectives. The bitterness is now expressed towards the powerless, and that's a relentless theme even in some of the greatest Christian writers. Well, it is true that a lot of Christian writers do condemn Jews or think that they were responsible for Christ's death kind of collectively. This is how they thought in history anyway. So collectivism is a bad thing, isn't it, Rowan? Whether you're talking about Christians or Muslims or Jews or whoever you're talking about, collectivism is bad. It's a shame you don't seem to think so. And also, I mean, I don't know why you call this bitterness anyway, that the Christians were bitter against the Jews and this is why they behaved in this way or wrote these things. I don't know whether they were bitter or not, but you do attribute things to other people like bitterness and resentment, and it's like you can read their mind or something, you know what motivates them, when they might be just unthinkingly saying something, or there might be some other motive, but you speak as if you've got some special insight into the motivations of other people, whereas in fact you're just making things up. And then you say, it's a relentless theme. This is anti-Semitism in Christian history, where it has cropped up quite a lot. That is true. Then you go on to say, it comes out in the art of the Middle Ages sometimes, in the ways that Jews are represented. It comes out in the drama of the Middle Ages. I don't really know what you're referring to. I don't know a lot about that kind of thing, about medieval art and drama. And you say, of course, at the end of the Middle Ages, in the early Renaissance period, it comes out in Spain in a set of legal enactments prohibiting people of Jewish birth from access to certain offices in the church. Well, you've picked Spain, 16th century Spain here you're talking about. You've selected this period of history and this geographical location to have a snipe at me because you know I'm very devoted to St John of the Cross, and I've also researched St John of the Cross, and there are other aspects to my devotion to St John of the Cross. That's all I'll say. But this is a snipe at me, isn't it? Because of all the geographical locations and periods in history you could have selected, you've selected 16th century Spain. Of course, I am an expert in this field, so I understand the context of it, that Jews were actually forced to leave Spain in 1492 unless they agreed to convert to Christianity. So the people who converted, most of them were probably not that enthusiastic about being Christians. So the concern would have been that these new converts are going to behave in a subversive way in the church, and this was why they were prohibited from holding certain offices. However, because Jewish men were very well educated compared to their Christian counterparts, in literacy is very important in Jewish culture, so many of them did in fact achieve high office in the church, and there were a high proportion of people from Jewish backgrounds who were holding diocesan offices, such as canons of cathedrals and that kind of thing. And rural parish priests were invariably of old Christian heritage, and they often weren't very literate and didn't know the faith very well, and so on. People were very ignorant in rural areas, and Jewish populations were usually centred on cities, and so this meant that Jewish converts were actually more likely to be found in these offices. They were never found as rural parish priests. So even though these laws were enacted, they didn't really pan out to anything in reality, and the reason for it was that they were concerned about people who had resentfully converted to Christianity subverting Christian teaching and subverting the church. And it is true that Jews are forced to leave Spain in 1492. I'm now going to read an extract from a book called Spain, The Root and the Flower. It's by John Rowan. It was published by the University of California Press in 1985, and I'm reading from page 148. It's a Jewish name, this. I don't know how to pronounce it. I've never read it out loud before. So here we are. What happened was there was an edict passed, and the Jews were being forced to leave Spain. Anyway, this is what happened next. Abrabanel went before the king and offered him a huge sum of money if the decree were lifted. Ferdinand was about to relent when Torquemada came bellowing into the room, holding aloft a crucifix and shouting that Judas had sold his master for 30 pieces of silver. The edict was not rescinded, and Abrabanel immediately determined to join his brethren in exile. At least 150,000 Jews left the country. Well, Torquemada was the head of the Inquisition. A lot of people have heard of him, but he was actually of Jewish ancestry as well. So if it weren't for a man of Jewish ancestry at the head of the Inquisition, then the Jews wouldn't have been forced to leave Spain. The King of Spain would have accepted the bribe, and the Jews would have been allowed to stay. So it's incorrect to say that Jews were never holding any office at that period in Spain, and in fact it was because of a man of Jewish ancestry that the king ended up not accepting a bribe to let them stay. Let me just see if I've got another thing to say about that. Oh, you say these laws are exactly like the laws of the Third Reich, and this is Christian Spain in the 16th century. You're being very theatrical about this and trying to look like you're absolutely disgusted. But of course you're working for the people who put the Third Reich in power anyway, so your opinions on this subject are quite astonishing, let's put it that way. You're always championing the underdog, and screwing the underdog at the same point in time, aren't you? Anyway, I shall leave that there and I shall make another comment in a minute.
Still hear strange words like Islamist, and I'm a bit puzzled by a word like that. You still hear this curious distinction between moderate and radical Muslims, that is, nice and nasty Muslims. These categories are meaningless. They don't correspond to what Muslims say about themselves. You just have to be there and listen to how people do describe themselves.
This consistent anti-Semitism, which seems to be a thread in European history.
To be honest, the Church has to take a very heavy share of responsibility. If you look at the beginnings of Christianity, you can see there a rhetoric which comes from the sense that Christians are a minority and Jewish authorities are making their lives difficult.
And that comes into the religious
You
tradition.
find that in the New Testament and the very earliest writings. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing at all, but it's immeasurably worse when the power relations have changed, when it becomes powerful Christians, powerless Jewish communities, or less powerful Jewish communities. And from at least the 4th Christian century onwards, that's the situation. The bitterness is now expressed towards the powerless, and that is a relentless theme, even in some of the very greatest of Christian writers. A relentless theme. It comes out in the art of the Middle Ages sometimes, in the way Jews are represented. It comes out in the drama of the Middle Ages. And of course, at the end of the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance period, it comes out in Spain in a set of legal enactments prohibiting people of Jewish birth from access to certain offices in the church. It's exactly like the laws of the Third Reich. And this is Christian Spain in the 16th century.
Yep.
So your friend now asks, what steps should we take to bridge the gap between different cultures and religions? And you say, there are certainly no magic solutions here. Well, you're involved in a magic solution, aren't you, which involves destroying traditional religions, including one that you're supposed to profess and practice, Christianity. The look on your face is quite interesting when you say there are certainly no magic solutions. And you're involved in Luciferian rituals, and you've sold your soul to Satan. So anyway, you say, first and foremost, we in Europe and elsewhere simply need to educate ourselves about what Islam really is. Oh, well, that's a good idea, isn't it? Shall we watch your videos about 9/11 or read what you've written about Muslims in West Yorkshire? That's a great idea, isn't it? Or shall we listen to the lecture where you said that Islam and Christianity were going to merge at some date in the future, and where you ignored points of actual convergence between the two faiths, such as the return of Christ as the judge, and also the fact that we all agree that there is no new revelation now, because for Christians there's no new revelation after the 2nd century, and for Muslims Muhammad was the last prophet, so there's no new revelation after Muhammad, so that's after the beginning of the 8th century. And so we all agree that there's no new revelation now, but you said in your lecture that revelation still occurs, and you said that the two religions were going to merge, and you contradicted both of these things, that there's no new revelation now, and also that the remote future of the church is that Christ will return as judge, which both religions agree about, and that's because it doesn't fit in with the globalist plan of undermining and destroying traditional religions and imposing a one world religion of environmentalism on all of us, which subjugates us to nature and basically means they can sterilise us and kill us all off and tell us we're not allowed to own property and we can't live where we want to. So you say, we need to listen really hard to the average Muslim neighbour. Well, as I've said, Rowan, you haven't got any Muslim neighbours. And we're just ordinary people. We don't categorise people into Muslims and non-Muslims, really, when we're just, you know, going in a shop and buying things, or going to work, or going to school, or whatever. You know, when I went to middle school, the end of our garden was the school wall, so everyone came round to my house before going to school, and just everybody came, Muslims or white people, everybody who was coming, girls anyway at that age, just girls came to my house. We didn't discriminate. We didn't, you know, shut the gate and put no Muslims allowed on the end of the gate. We're just people. It's you who's putting people in categories. And, you know, people prefer to practice their own religion and often to marry someone of their own religion. But in terms of just getting on with people in wider society, at work and at school and stuff like that, we're just people. Not the extremist voice, but to the real variety that you'll hear outside any mosque on a Friday. Well, this just shows how much you know. Doesn't it, Rowan? Because, you know, from a lot of backgrounds, I mean, from certain areas of Pakistan, it's not traditional for Muslim women to pray in the mosque. If they do pray, they usually pray at home. And, you know, there's disagreement about this. Some women want to go to the mosque and so on. But not all mosques, and certainly a lot of mosques around this area in West Yorkshire don't have a place for women to pray, and women and men don't pray together in Islam, they pray separately. So women don't go to the mosque because there's nowhere for them to pray. So if you're listening to the real variety of voices that you hear outside any mosque on a Friday, then a lot of times you're only listening to men. And you would have thought, you being so clued up on this and wanting to liberate women from patriarchy, that you would have known about that, wouldn't you? And in any case, you know, it wouldn't really be appropriate for you to be going and approaching Muslim women. It's just not really that appropriate, really, to be going into a mosque or around a mosque and for a male to be approaching Muslim women to involve himself with them. Anyway, you then say a prayer. So you say, "May God our Creator open our hearts and our ears to one another. May God our Creator, whose will is for our peace and our well-being, lead us hand in hand towards a true worldwide community." I'm not even going to say anything about that. "In which none is forgotten, none is oppressed, and none is humiliated." Well, you're into the business of oppressing people and humiliating them and trying to drive them to suicide and stigmatising them as terrorists, aren't you? So you say, "May God our Creator teach us to value and revere the signs of His presence in each one of us." There aren't really a lot of signs of His presence in you, Rowan. It's obliterated by the fact that you've devoted yourself to Satan and you practice satanic things, in particular that you lie about absolutely everything. You lie just for the sake of it in some cases. "So that in all things there will be peace and there will be the peace and reconciliation that our Lord God requires." I don't know who you're praying to, Rowan. You're making a political statement here through the medium of God. Anyway, I've been going on for quite some time now, so I suppose I'd better leave it there, otherwise I shall still be uploading this video this time next week. So have a nice weekend, and don't forget I may be arresting you in St Albans on Sunday, and I'm sure I'll have a lot of supporters in St Albans, so be alert. Hasta la próxima.
Grace, what steps should we take to bridge the gap between different cultures and religions? With your vast experience, what steps would you suggest, 1, 2, 3 as it were?
There are certainly no magic solutions here, but I would say, first and foremost, we in Europe and elsewhere simply need to educate ourselves about what Islam really is. We need to listen very hard to the average Muslim neighbour, not the extremist voice, but to the real variety that you'll hear outside any mosque on a Friday.
We would request you to say a few words of support.
May God, our Creator, open our hearts and our ears to one another. May God, our Creator, whose will is for our peace and our well-being, lead us hand in hand towards a true worldwide community in which none is forgotten, none is oppressed, none is humiliated. May God, our Creator, teach us to value and to revere the signs of His presence in each one of us, so that in all things there will be the peace and reconciliation that our Lord God requires. Amen.